It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here to celebrate the publication of Yochi Dreazen's new book, The Invisible Front, Love and Loss in an Era of Endless War. Yochi, as many of you know, is quite simply one of the very best national security journalists in America today. He's the managing editor of Foreign Policy. He has spent nearly 4 years on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq reporting and spending most of his time embedded in frontline combat units. He was before that a long-time reporter for the Wall Street Journal and has served as a contributing editor to The Atlantic and a senior national security correspondent for National Journal. But above and beyond all of these illustrious journalism accomplishments, Yochi's readers, which I think include most of us in this room, discern in his writings a deeply human touch and a full appreciation of war's costs during and after the battle. In recognition of this, he's received the Military Reporters and Editors Association Top Award for domestic military reporting for his 2010 series on military suicide and the psychological traumas impacting veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. At CNAS, we're privileged that Yochi wrote his book while a writer in residence at the center. And during his year with us, we discovered that not only is he a world-class author, but also a wonderful colleague and friend. His deep insight into the human side of war was vitally important into all of the thinking that we did on our own projects and writing, and it fully animates the book that we're here tonight to celebrate. In The Invisible Front, he tells the story of the Grahams, a couple who suffered the loss of 2 sons, one to combat and one to suicide. In their grief, they turned towards service of their own and helped lead a drive to stem military suicide, and they embraced a cause that has become far larger than any individual or family. Yochi tells their story with his characteristic grace, and it's a book that deserves to be very widely read and appreciated. Now, if I've convinced you of that latter fact, you'll be pleased to know that books will be for sale, and you can purchase them after the conversation on stage, and Yochi will be available to sign your copies. We are going to start the proceedings this evening with Yochi giving us a brief sort of synopsis and overview of the book, and then we'll go into conversation from there and then open it up to the audience for questions. But it's my special privilege and pleasure to introduce Yochi Dreazen. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Before I start, I want to thank Richard, thank some people in the back of the room, Jarrell Clay, Kate Kidd, Phil Carter, Sean, Nate Fick. There are a lot of people in the CNAS family who made me feel welcome when I was guzzling free Coke Zero and trying to rustle up any food beyond the granola bars that were haphazardly sprinkled through the office to fuel a year of writing. But I'm very grateful to them for that time. I'm very grateful to all of you for coming. I look forward to talking, to hearing your thoughts and your questions. Mark and Carol Graham, the family that are at the center of this book, had for a long time a Norman Rockwell-type family. They had 3 children who were all extraordinarily close. Kevin, who was the middle child, was sensitive. He was sort of the perfect one who, when his parents would say do something, he would do it without hesitation, without thinking. Jeff, his older brother, was the more rambunctious one. He drank. He was very, very good with women. He was someone who was the life of a party. Kevin would follow into the party but would sort of sit by himself in the corner. And then Melanie, who was their young sister, she was the one that they tried to look out for. Wherever they went in the world, the 3 of them were a single unit. They were the 3 of them against the world because, like many military families, as so many of you know, they moved from base to base, from country to country, and have to rebuild a social network wherever they went. And for the 2 boys, they were patriotic in every sense of the phrase. They looked at their father. They watched him ascend from his early start in Kentucky to being a captain in Germany, to moving on to Korea, to moving and doing some tours in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And to them, this was the highest honor. This was the highest kind of public service. And they both wanted to do the same thing. So they went to the University of Kentucky. They went to the ROTC program, each one planning to be an officer. For Jeff, it was to lead men into combat. For Kevin, it was to be a doctor. It was to try to help others. Flash forward a few years. Jeff is out. He was the older of the 2. He's commissioned. He's getting ready to go to Iraq. His brother Kevin, a year younger, about to enter the final summer before he'd be commissioned and also enter the Army. What no one in the family knew, because Kevin had always been smart, he'd always been funny, he'd always been just the sweetheart of the family, was that there was a darkness inside of him that he was trying very hard to control and failing. And he was diagnosed with depression, with clinical depression, and put on medication, which brought his mood down. But that summer, he thought, if I enter the military and they discover them on this medication, they'll kick me out. My career will be done before it starts, so I can't take it. And so he stopped taking it. And that decision sent him spiraling. After his death, his family found a to-do list that he had left for himself, most of which was banal. Do laundry, pick up food, and the last item was take toaster into the bathtub. But they didn't find this out till much, much too late. He and Jeff had always played golf. That was their sport. And they were supposed to meet one morning to play. It was going to be one of the last rounds before Jeff left to do his last bit of training and then on to Iraq. And Kevin didn't show up. And Jeff was wondering and looking at his watch and looking at his cell phone, and his brother wasn't there. So he called the apartment, he called his sister and said, Melanie, have you seen Kevin? And she hadn't. And she knocked on his door and didn't hear anything. And she opened the door and she saw him hanging. He had hung himself in the ceiling fan. And at first she thought it was a prank. She thought her brothers were just trying to pull one over like they had in the past, but then the horror set in and she realized it wasn't. And that sent her spiraling, and sent Mark spiraling, and sent Carol spiraling. Mark thought, I can't serve in the Army anymore. Carol thought, I may not be able to live anymore. She was suicidal. They pulled through, but just barely. A year later, Jeff, who by this point was an infantry lieutenant, was leading his men on a bridge, a mission to clear a bridge near Fallujah. It was an actual particularly part that I've spent time in that at that moment was one of the bloodiest, most dangerous parts of the entire country. Jeff was leading from the front. He was walking ahead of his men, and he saw something glimmering on the bridge. And he didn't know what it was, but something to him said, it's not good. And so he turned to the men behind him to say, stay back. And as he turned, the bomb blew up. It was an IED buried on the bridge. He died, his men didn't. So now the family has lost 2 sons. They find out that on his last mission, when he left the base, Jeff had on him, in his wallet, his brother's driver's license. And the parents said to themselves, they were so close in life, at least they're so close in death. And that was how they tried to pull through. So now Mark and Carol face this question that I think to anybody in the room with children is probably a question maybe is being wondered now of, if you lose 1 child, how do you pull through? And if you lose 2, how do you get out of bed? I mean, how do you find anything that could fill that void? And at first, they thought they couldn't. They thought that this was the end for both of them. For Mark, the military's done. He thought, if only I had prevented Jeff from going to Iraq, he'd still be alive. If only I had said to Kevin, you don't need to do this, he'd not have taken himself off medication, he'd still be alive. But they decided there was still a way to go. Carol said to Mark one night, this is either a chapter in our life or this is the book. And they decided it would be a chapter. Mark came back. At this point, he's beginning to ascend higher and higher up, and he has more prominence, more power. And what he sees around him, and what we all know to be true, tragically, is this wave of people coming back with PTSD, with wounds that you can't see. This wave of people coming back who are beginning to take their own lives, and the suicide rate is rising and rising and rising. First, in 2009, it hits and then goes past the civilian rate. Then in 2010, the difference continues to grow. Then on and on to where we are now, where more people have killed themselves than died in Afghanistan by a significant margin, where more people kill themselves every year than the year that preceded it. So this year, so far, it's about 350 people, many of them in the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve. So Mark came back, and this was what he was discovering. And what he found was that it wasn't just this clinical antiseptic term of stigma, which is a real issue. I mean, it's the accurate phrase. But that there was something in the culture of the Army that he saw, the culture of the base where he was in command of, Fort Carson, that had a callousness to it and a cruelty. In one particular case at Fort Carson, in the brigade headquarters, near where you would sign out to go see a doctor, someone hung up a sheet that said, I'm going to see a psychologist because A, I'm a coward, B, I'm soft, C, all of the above. And this wasn't there for a few hours as a prank, this was there for days. In another case, someone wrote a suicide note on their wall. Thankfully, they were gotten into help before it was too late, but the Army court-martialed him for defacing Army property. So this was what Mark was finding. This was the stigma that he was finding. And meanwhile, he's seeing the suicide numbers tick up higher and higher and higher. So he's confronted now at Fort Carson with a base that had the highest suicide rate of any base in the military. And he's a person who understands more than any officer in the military what it is to lose someone to a wound that you can't see, what it is to lose someone who you love when you didn't know that they needed help until it was too late to give it to them. And he knows that for many of these young soldiers at the base, and for their spouses and for their kids, that's exactly what they're struggling with, that exact same question. So Mark decides to do what he can to change it. And the policies he puts in place are ones that are ultimately replicated across the Army. So one, which some of them, they're so obvious sounding that even now I wonder how they were not done sooner. But the truth is they weren't. One was a hotline where if you called it, the call went to his personal assistant and then straight to him. So it wasn't something where you'd call and the call would bounce around, and by the time it got to somebody who could help, it was too late. It was a direct line to him. That's now been replicated, not where a call goes to a general, but where a call goes into a better, more defined system. Another, and again, it seems like it should be obvious, but it wasn't. At Fort Carson, the mental health facility and the hospital were in the same building. One floor, one a different floor. So if you were a soldier brave enough to risk being mocked for seeking help, brave enough that you were willing to accept that your career might literally end if someone saw you seeking help, if you were willing to do all of that, if you were that brave, and you walked into that elevator, you knew that at any moment somebody else would see you hit 6, and they would know you were going there. That something that you felt you might need to keep secret was no longer going to be secret. So Mark said that makes no sense, and he moved them to a different facility. Another one, and this is one that's now been replicated across the Army. Like most things in the Army, it has a horrible acronym, which I won't tell you about, Embedded Behavioral Health Team, and we could put the letters together, and it's really hard to pronounce. But the basic idea was, rather than have a psychologist who might be a stranger to a unit, or a therapist where soldiers come back and there's someone they've never seen before who says, well, tell me how you feel. And the soldier's thinking, who the hell are you? Why should I trust you? How can you possibly know who I am? And they clam up. So the idea instead was have a single therapist assigned to a single brigade from the beginning, before they deploy, while they're deployed, when they come back. So this will be someone that that brigade has seen and gotten to know, and has gotten to know them. And the idea was they would come back and this would not be a stranger. This would not be someone where the brigade or the soldier or the officer would say, who the hell are you? This is someone that they knew. And that worked, and it worked tremendously, tremendously well. And Mark had an ally that he did not expect at Fort Carson. And I mention this story because, this next story, just because it gives you a little bit of a sense of some of the people that were pushing against what he was doing and some of the people who were pushing for it. The people who were pushing against were saying, people who have these PTSD, who have depression, they are weak. Some of them are trying to just get out of doing military service. They don't deserve to wear a uniform. Why are you coddling them? That was the phrase that people said about him when he wasn't around. They would say he was soft. And that was the word that hung over him his whole time at Fort Carson, that he was soft. But then you had people who were battle-hardened, who were the toughest of the tough, the people you would think would definitely not be the people who would agree that these wounds were real, or would agree with changes about how you treat them. One of them was a man then, Colonel Randy George, now Brigadier General Randy George, a very well-deserved promotion, who was the toughest of the tough. He did multiple tours in Afghanistan. This was a man who'd seen combat. He'd led men in combat. He'd been there as a lieutenant colonel, then as a colonel. And for him, it was also personal, but for a different reason. In Afghanistan, during one particularly bloody stretch for his brigade, a general, a soldier that was unusually gentle and thoughtful, just someone who really didn't, in some ways, belong, that wasn't the place for him. But he was in the military, he was in Afghanistan, and he killed himself. And the question Randy George faced was, what do you do? I mean, how do you memorialize someone who killed themselves? Do you treat them the same way that you would treat a person who died in combat? Do you put them on the same memorial wall? Do you give them a military funeral? Do you put them into a church? What do you do? Do you give them a cemetery? Do you give them full military honors? What do you do? And Randy George's men said, sir, this man does not deserve the same kind of honor. And Randy George said, he sure does. He was with us fighting here. He died because of what he saw and what he did. No different. He died, he was a casualty of war, so we will give him the same memorial. And they did. For many of you who have seen the way the memorials are done in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're extraordinarily powerful. It's the two boots standing, the gun facing down, the dog tags hanging from the gun, and then often a helmet near it. But Randy George became an ally. Randy George became someone that Mark Graham, who was derided as soft, now had this very tough man who was in his corner. And by the time Mark left, the suicide rate at Fort Carson had plummeted. It had been the highest when he got there. It was one of the lowest when he left. I don't want to suggest that there was a happy ending to this. Fort Carson's suicide rate is still high. As all of you here probably know, the Army suicide rate is still high. It's not something where Mark and Carol left, went there, found a problem, solved it, moved on, things were hunky-dory and good. The military now accepts that there's a suicide problem. It did not accept in the past, it does now. There is tremendous amounts of money being spent, hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars. So the military that exists today is not the military that existed then. But there's no silver bullet. This is not an epidemic that's been cured. This is not something where, with the best of intentions, the best, strongest people in the military have been able to fix. But let me go back for a second to Mark and Carol. Mark and Carol find purpose in this. The pain of what they were experiencing never went away. I've known them now for 5 years. They worked with me on the book. They've stayed at my house. They've spent time with my wife. They're family, and I feel like family to them. And I've seen them talk about their sons. I've seen them do it 10, 15 times. And every time they do it, it's a decade later now since Kevin's death, almost a decade since Jeff's, every time they do it, they tear up. You know, the word closure is tossed around and it's facile. There is no closure for people who've lost 2 children. That pain never leaves them. But they're feeling when they stand in a place like this and they talk to a crowd of people that they look at who they don't know, they think maybe one person in that crowd is struggling. Maybe one person in that crowd thinks, if I seek help, I'm weak. Maybe one person in that crowd thinks, if I seek help, I'm flawed. Maybe one person in that crowd is hovering right on that line between getting help when they need it, surviving, not getting help when they need it, not surviving. And they think if that one person reacts differently, if that one person gets help, if that one person says to a friend of theirs, as someone, a close friend, said to me once, you need help. If that person does it, then it's worth for them reliving the pain. And I'll close with this and then take as many questions as there's interest and time to ask. For them, this is an 11-year fight that's still going. And they found happiness. They have found a way of living. They have found a way of finding a meaning and a purpose. Their daughter, Melanie, who's also a close friend, she'll be here this Sunday running the Army 10-miler. She'll have Kevin's face on one side. She'll have Jeff's face on the other. She's made a life. When you meet her, you would not know that this was a girl who had the tragedy of seeing a brother kill himself, a girl who buried her other brother a year later. She's found happiness. She's found love. And occasionally, she feels guilty. You know, she wonders, do I deserve to feel happiness? Is something wrong with me that I'm able to laugh and love when I've lost my brothers? But she's found happiness. She's found a way of getting through life. And fittingly, she's a nurse. She's trying to do what Kevin wanted to do. She's trying to help other people. And so I leave you with that. It's very easy for us as a country to say, we support the troops. It's easy to applaud at a baseball game. It's easy to put something onto the back of a car. And that's all wonderful. That's all better than it was for the people who served in Vietnam. There's nothing wrong with it. But soldiers who come back, they're not simply people you applaud. These are real people. These are people who are drawn from our society, who reflect our society, and we reflect them. Suicide is not an issue just the Army is dealing with. When cars were created till 2010, the thing that killed the most people other than illness were car crashes. That was from the Model T till 2010. Then in 2010, suicide took more lives than car crashes. And as with the Army, that suicide rate, the difference is getting bigger and bigger. And for a long time in the civilian world, suicide was something that high school kids did. You know, high school kids were bullied. Bullying still exists, obviously, and they killed themselves. College kids were stressed that if their grades weren't good, they'd fail their parents. They killed themselves. And that was where you had to really worry about suicide, was with those age groups. Now where you're seeing the biggest rise is among men in their 50s and 60s. And these are men who didn't serve. These are not men who went to Vietnam and came back damaged. In many cases, these are men who lost their job and figured, I may never get another job. I may never be able to support my family again. I can't live like this, so I choose to not live. And that's where the rate now is rising. And so I leave you with that. The military is a microcosm and a reflection. It's not as if we can stand back and say it's them. It's not as that we can stand back and say it's not us, because it is. There are people in this room who are friends who I recognize who are serving now or have served in the past. They know this all too well. Those of us in the room who have not served but spent time with the military or care about it, we know it all too well. There's a disconnect that does not need to be there. And on an issue like mental health, an issue like suicide, it's dangerous for it to be there. And I close with saying that for Mark and Carol, 11 years on, they're doing what they can to bridge it. I hope in our way, people who read the book, my hope in writing the book was to also help bridge it in as best of way as I can. I thank you all for your time and look forward to taking your questions.
Well, I think we can all see just how, excuse me, how vital the issues are and how how insightful the work that Yochi has done in this book are. And now to take it into the conversational portion of the evening, we have Major Garrett with us, who is probably well known to many of you as the chief White House correspondent for CBS News, and also a correspondent for National Journal. And Major, over to you.
I just want to apologize to everyone. The conspiratorial nature of DC traffic was indifferent to this event, but it in no way is a commentary on Yochi's work or the extraordinary nature of this book. I just wonder if I could, for a second, say this book is personal to me on a couple of levels, because you talk about Mark as a transformational member of the Army after Vietnam. My cousin Craig, who just died 2 weeks ago of Parkinson's disease, was also one of those who served in Vietnam and decided to stay, be a part of that junior officer corps that changed the Army for the better after Vietnam. He did not go through these issues, but he is a brother of all those who decided to stick it out and make the Army a better place after Vietnam. So in that way, the book resonated to me. I have 2 dear friends whose children committed suicide in college as civilians. That also resonates with me. And if you read this book, you read a book about tragedy, but also transformation. That's sort of where I want to begin with you, Yochi, because at the White House, the president now signs letters in the same way he does to someone who has died in combat, to someone who has committed suicide. And that was a transformation within the building itself. Should the president do the same thing? Should these be on equal levels? So the transformation is working itself through gradually. And there was something sort of beneficial about me not being here at first, because you heard from the author himself, and he can deal with this so much more articulately than I can. But Yochi, I want to start with what you ended with, that this isn't a happy ending. This is the beginning of a process that is going to carry on for a very long time. Where would you say we, Army culture, military culture, society, are in dealing with this, comprehending it, and how long do you think it will be before any of us can say a corner has been turned?
I think that we're at a point now where it's understood and accepted, which is wonderful. And it sounds like it's a low bar, but it's not. I mean, for a long time, there was pushback at the idea that PTSD existed. For a long time, there was pushback that the suicide epidemic even existed. And that's gone. I mean, there's now a deep acceptance that's there. There's a deep, deep push to try to solve it, and that's great. And that's a massive improvement. The stigma is still there. When you look at polling done of soldiers, they still feel scared about seeking help. So it's understood. There's an effort to fix it. It's not yet fixed. And I think, Major, one reason for it is the Army is obviously the definition of a hierarchy, right? We think of it, we think the Army, for obvious reasons. Over the course of reporting the book, I spoke to generals I had gotten to know in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I asked them about their own experiences, and many of them described what was textbook PTSD. They said that they came back and their wives didn't recognize them, their kids didn't recognize them, they had nightmares, they had flashes of anger, all the things that if you understand PTSD, that is PTSD. And these are men at the pinnacle of their career. And I asked them, can I use your story, can I use your name? And with one exception, the answer was no. And until that changes, until you have people at the very top of the military being willing to say to the people at the bottom end of the military, you can get through this, you can have a career, you can have a family, you can have a life that's healthy and full. Until that changes, this issue won't change.
Mike Mullen talked to you about that, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There's a quote in here: in order to make strides in eliminating stigma, leadership must step forward and acknowledge their own post-traumatic stress while setting the example by visibly seeking help. That's what he told you. Let me talk about the terminology, because some people on Twitter, as I was promoting this event, said, why don't we drop the D? Just call it post-traumatic stress and not add to the stigma, or at least validate part of the stigma by calling it a disorder. Is that a conversation that you had in researching and developing the book?
It is, and it's a fair question, to be honest. It's a question that is talked about a lot within the military and even outside the military about, if you call it a disorder, are you saying that there's an illness, that a person is sick, that they're broken in some way? And there are a lot of people who care about the issue, care deeply about the issue, but believe that when you say it's a disorder, a person won't seek help because they hear that as, I'm broken, I can't be fixed, why should I even come forward? And it is a serious issue. At the higher ranks of the Army, General Odierno, the current Chief of Staff, the current heads of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, when Mike Mullen was running the Joint Chiefs, when Bob Gates was the Secretary of Defense, all of them felt like the phrase should be PTS, post-traumatic stress. One of the interviews in the book that I found very powerful was with Bob Gates. And Bob Gates, this is not a man prone to being overly emotional. This is like the taciturn, tough Kansan, the Cold Warrior. He's not a man who's a softie by any stretch. But I asked him about his own experience at the Pentagon and what he thought of it, of what he'd seen, what he had done. And what he said to me, and it's stuck with me since, was he felt that by the time he left, he had post-traumatic stress of some sort because of visiting burn wards and going to cemeteries, writing condolence letters, thousands of them. He felt that it had changed him. And he told me that he knew he had to leave the White House because whenever he was asked a question about any issue, about Libya, about any issue of strategy, all he thought of was the soldiers who would come back missing limbs, the soldiers who would come back with burns, and that he couldn't give advice to the president about anything at a higher level because all he thought was the human cost. And the phrase he uses is post-traumatic stress.
Mm-hmm. And we'll take questions as we move along, right? We can do that at any moment. So why don't we just do that and go to the questions? I know folks here want to jump into this. So I see your hand up there, ma'am. Go right ahead, please. The microphone is coming your way.
My name is Ann Sarkis, and I just spent the last 5 years at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center taking care of soldiers coming home. And you listen to their nightmares, you listen to their crying and their tears and their hopes and their dreams. And we can talk about this till the cows come home. I'm sorry, I'm from New England. But the problem that I see, and I don't know if you have any insight on this, is that middle management across the ranks needs to be held accountable when they court-martial a soldier for writing a suicide note on the wall. I can't tell you how many times soldiers have told me, I asked my colonel to send me to the chaplain, or I asked my colonel to send me to the psychiatrist, and he swore at me. I can't repeat what the soldiers tell me because, you know. But anyway, this happens more than once a day. And it happened for years, the whole 5 years I was there. So I can't even imagine after leaving there 3 years ago, and still hearing these stories. Is the Army or the military in general doing anything across the board to hold the supervisors and the colonels or whatever rank the supervisor is accountable and giving them like a sensitivity course and holding them accountable that if some, you know, and checking them and saying, you know what, if you can't look at your soldier and recognize post-traumatic stress, then you don't need to be in this position.
Or at least not be hostile to them when they express a desire for help or do something that is suggestive of help.
Yes. It's a great question, and it's a fair one. It's one that I talk about a little bit in the back of the books. I'm glad you brought it up. Right now, the short answer is no, that the average officer, the average non-enlisted, non-commissioned officer, excuse me, is not held accountable if there is a suicide or a spate of suicides in their unit. When Pete Corelli was the vice chief of staff, he would hold a weekly, and at one point a monthly, video teleconference where if a suicide had taken place in a given unit, the commander had to give him a very detailed explanation of what happened. But that is not what you're talking about, because that's at the very high level. To my mind, this will change only when you build in a system of accountability. If you're a colonel and you're up for promotion and they discover that there were 50 people in your unit who were arrested for drinking and driving, or for beating their wives, or other serious things like that, you probably won't get promoted. Right. But right now, if they discover that 3 people in your unit killed themselves, or 20 of them sought help and were turned away, you don't have that same punishment. And until that changes, I agree with you, I don't think this goes away. There was a moment that illustrated this in a slightly different angle about 8 months ago, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff were summoned to the Hill to talk about sexual assault. Claire McCaskill, the senator who was pushing forward along with a different bill from Senator Gillibrand about sexual assault. The only place where PTSD is seen at a rate comparable to combat is victims of sexual assault. If you've been raped, it doesn't matter gender, but if you've been raped, your likelihood of developing PTSD is exactly the same as a soldier in combat. And if you guys remember the hearing, they were summoned there, so you have these intimidating men and bedecked in all of their medals. And the question was, can you point to anyone that you've relieved of command because of sexual assault in their unit? And went to the head of the Marine Corps, and the answer was no. Went to the head of the Air Force, the answer was no. And ultimately, there were 2 people who said yes. There was the head of the Coast Guard and General Odierno. But that was it. And in both cases, they could each think of one person. So there, too, you have a culture where this tragedy is happening, this horrific crime, where you're beginning to see suicides among female soldiers, which have been unheard of. mainly female soldiers who were the victims of sexual assault. But in neither case is a person held accountable. And I agree with you, they should be. And until they are, this won't change.
And one other thing you brought out in the book is that soldiers or Marines who feel this are afraid if they raise their hand, they are canceling out their opportunity to be promoted. So you have it on both sides of the continuum. They're afraid to say anything because their career might be derailed, and those who are indifferent or hostile, careers aren't derailed.
Exactly, and it's, to take one example that, again, it's the Air Force. Don't mean to pick on the Air Force, but if you're a pilot, and especially this really hits female pilots because the rape situation is so often with female members of the service. But if you're raped and you suffer PTSD or anything happens that you suffer PTSD, you can't fly. It's taken away from you as a precaution. So inadvertently, basically, you're victimizing the person twice. The person was assaulted, was raped, whatever the issue. So there's that horrible trauma, that crime committed against them. And then they also lose the thing that they want to do and train to do their whole life. So there are cases where a person is punished in a way for two different reasons, but the end result of it is the person feels twice victimized. And the stigma, it remains real. And it remains real for a good reason, which is that there is a chance that if you seek help, your careers can end. So it's not that there's this wholly irrational fear about doing it. It's in some ways very rational, which makes it all the more heartbreaking. The fact that still today, if you seek help, there is a chance your career will end still today. So we talk about stigma, we don't talk about it in the past. We have to recognize it's in the present.
Next question. It's a little hard to see. Oh, right here in the row. Right there.
Hi, hey Yochi, Cam Ritchie here.
Hey, Cam.
And I'm with an incredibly distinguished group of people, including Jackie Garrett, head of the DoD Suicide Prevention Office. Congratulations first on your book. But I wanted to emphasize one of the points that you made, that in a downsizing military, it's just incredibly hard for anybody to come forward for treatment. Basically, nobody will come and seek treatment unless they've already been identified as going out the door, and then that's where they'll get there. This is a problem that does not have an easy solution, but again, just something to recognize that no matter all the platitudes we have about reducing stigma, the reality is that if you want to have a career in the military, you don't want to be seen as going to get help. And I think the recent RAND report that just came out, and Meg may be able to corroborate that, said that again, service members won't go to seek treatment.
Yochi, do you think this is generational, that it will take a generation of those who are promoted to the middle ranks, who have been exposed to this, who have a different concept of this organically from their early service and their time in this particular space within our military? That generational transformation is what's ultimately going to be the answer, because they will have grown up in a culture and have come to different conclusions than those who are above them in rank now?
I hope so. I really, really do hope so. I think.
I mean, do you think that's really the only thing that's ultimately going to be the wave that transforms things, or do you think it can happen before that? Because a generational wave would be
a long time off.
10 to 20 years.
Yeah, I think it could shift before that, but I think the generation and the age issue, it does matter. I mean, if you're growing up today, you're growing up where you see commercials all the time for Zoloft, for Xanax, for all kinds of. It's part of the culture. It's something that people discuss pretty openly. And I do think that that matters. I do think that there is an age difference where somebody younger coming up where this is openly discussed, as compared to somebody older where it wasn't, we'll see it differently. One that's been very interesting in researching the book and to talk to people about the book is almost everyone I talk to says at some point in the conversation, you know, I know somebody, and then it's one of a few things. I know somebody who killed themselves. I know somebody who sought help. I know somebody in my family, me, my wife, my husband, my child. It reminds me of what I imagine alcoholism was 50 or 60 years ago, where every family had someone in it who was alcoholic or knew someone who was alcoholic, but nobody felt comfortable talking about it. I think that's where we are with this, that almost everyone I've spoken to, and I think this is true probably for many people in the room, knows someone for whom this has been an issue, a part of their life, but it's still not quite talked about openly. It's like right below the surface, one notch away, but it's not quite there.
Next one. Yes, sir. Thank you so much. The microphone's coming right. It'll be right there.
Department of Mental Health, Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health. For many years, military regulations have prohibited the continued retaining and deployment of soldiers with diagnosed mental health disorders. and soldiers on multiple psychotropic medications. And for good reason, because we know that soldiers with pre-existing mental health disorders, when exposed to the stresses of trauma, are at much higher risk of chronic morbidity as a result of this. And yet for many years, the US military turned a blind eye to the deployment of soldiers with diagnosed mental disorders on multiple psychotropic drugs. 10% or more of soldiers deployed with conditions that ordinarily would have made them non-deployable. And I think we can all recognize the reason for this was that we could not have met our manpower requirements without this. What does the current epidemic of mental disorders in the military and this practice say about the sustainability of the all-volunteer force?
I think that when it comes to the kind of baseline question of, one, will the military continue to function to be as effective as it has been? And two, a parallel part of this question, I mean, you didn't ask it in a direct way, but it's often implied of, should we go back to a draft? Should we in some way spread the burden so it's not the same 1% deploying again and again and again and again? I think the question that was asked before by Cam Ritchie, where you have a shrinking military, unfortunately, the problem gets worse because people are now competing for jobs and feeling like, well, if I know that that guy's a little bit off some days and I know that guy's not, I'm taking the one who's not a little bit off. I think the military is sustainable. I mean, it's a massive, healthy institution, but this is a bigger strain in many ways than the things we normally think of as strains. A person comes back missing a limb, it's horrific. A person comes back with terrible burns, it's horrific. But we sort of know as a society how to view that person, how to treat that person. If we see someone with a cane limping along and they're missing their leg, we can kind of guess what might have happened. We could probably be compassionate to them because we can see that they suffered in a very visible way. When a person comes back and that's not there, and you look at them and you don't know that's the case, we don't really know how to process that. You know, I think we have a friend that has come back, he had had very serious issues, and he looked fine. Nothing about how he carried himself, his demeanor, he was a muscular, kind of hulking guy, and he had a therapy dog. And he would walk into a McDonald's and the people would say, get your dog out of here, that's not a service dog. You're fine, you're not blind, you're not walking with a limp. How could you have a service dog? He had crippling PTSD to the point that he almost died. But because nobody could see it, nobody treated him with the way you would treat somebody who was missing a limb. And sustainable, yes. People let in who shouldn't be, yes. But that issue, that way of not being able to quite understand or quite have that level of compassion that you would to someone whose wound was visible, that's a serious issue. And I don't know how that changed or how long it takes for it to change.
And if you don't mind, let me enlarge that question a bit. Sustainable, possibly optimal, though. I mean, it seems that inherent in the book is an underlying conclusion that multiple deployments, by their very nature, increase the likelihood of these very problems. And if you have a finite and shrinking force and you are in a war footing, you are going to have multiple deployments. And each and every deployment, I would think, I don't know mathematically, but it would almost seem exponentially would increase the likelihood of these kinds of psychological traumas. Is it optimal? It may be sustainable, but from the military's perspective, is it optimal?
No, and it's a great point. No, it's not. I mean, when you have people going, it is known that the likelihood of something happening, obviously, it does go up if you're on 500 patrols, because it's your fifth tour as opposed to 100, but also that the traumas can build. I mean, if you hear an explosion and hear another explosion and X number on one tour, and then that doubles the tour after, even just the hearing of it, you know, the seeing the smoke, if you're not hurt, if you're not seeing a body in front of you, even that builds up over time. PTSD itself builds up over time. This is something where you come back and it's not as if you have it and then it's cured in 5 years, it's gone. You could have it for decades. I mean, you could be struggling, whether we call it PTSD, you could be struggling with it for decades. So it could be something where you come back and you're pretty much okay. You're having nightmares now and then, but for the most part, you're functional. And then 20 years later, something happens and you have a break. And it's hard to predict, it's hard to know, and it's hard to cure because it's not something where you could see the immediate illness, figure out a treatment method, and then know that it's gone. You know, one thing that in Mark and Carol's own experience that they saw, there was a young soldier that was hired to be Mark's aide to camp, to be basically, you know, the guy who did his laundry and picked up his stuff and helped with his paperwork, a guy named Mike Pelkey. And Mike Pelkey, when Mark hired him, was this perfect soldier, a guy that Mark thought, this guy is brilliant, this guy is organized, this guy is smart, he's good looking, he can do the job perfectly. Mike Pelkey had deep depression. Even Mark, who by this point had already lost Kevin, Mark didn't see it. This was something that Mike Pelkey had been building for several years. His wife got glimpses, his chaplain had glimpses, but nobody saw it. And then it built and it built and it built, and suddenly it burst. And Mike Pelkey killed himself the day before he was supposed to start working for Mark Graham. But this was something where, as you say exactly and correctly, that it wasn't that he went on one tour, came back, and poof, everything was terrible. It was that he went and came back, and things built and built and built until finally there was that break.
And I can tell you, when you get to that part of the book, as heartbreaking as everything in the narrative up until that point was, that was among the most devastating things I came across in the book. That this guy that Mark believed in, was so confident about, felt so good about, and the proximity of this undiagnosed, unseen, yet ravaging internal trauma hits him again. I mean, it's just devastating in the book, and illustrative of so many things that are hard to see, and even when you're intentionally trying to see, can't always be found. And it's incredibly poignant in the book. Yes, sir, right here.
Hello, Dave Mattingly. And going back to what you were saying about General Gates, and I think a point that you made in the book was that when soldiers deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and sometimes they were looked at as they were going to, oh, he's going to be a rear echelon. He was going to be sitting on a fob. But in reality, going back and either seeing their buddies coming back from patrol or their fob coming under attack, that they were still going to sustain the additional trauma of PTS. And it's not something that you can say, well, he wasn't infantry or he wasn't out walking the line every day, that the PTSD is still out there for other people that are involved in the operations.
It's a very fair point. I mean, in some cases, I know people who believe that their PTSD came from hearing explosions again and again and again, where it wasn't that they saw something horrific or they were shot or their friend was shot, but it's just the impact of explosion, 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 never quite knowing, is it going to hit you, is it going to hit the base? Agree completely. I mean, it doesn't have to be something, we think trauma, we think often of something really dramatic. You know, you're walking on a foot patrol and your friend next to you gets shot. No question that's traumatic. But trauma can be different. It could be things that on its face don't look quite as bad and don't look quite as severe. But when they build one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, the end result is the same. You know, it takes you kind of to the same dark place.
Yeah, yes, sir, right here. And then I'll come to you, Matt, next time, sir.
Thanks. Izzy Abbas, VFW Post 1. One quick question, though. What do we, even if we're successful in getting the military, members of the military, educated on dealing with PTS and working with soldiers who are coming back and things like that, what are we doing to work with the civilian community out there? Because if they were remiss in terms of seeking treatment while they were in the service, they get out, there's all kinds of stories out there about the ticking time bombs of veterans. We need to also educate the civilian community on that. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. My dear friend Phil Carter is here, and this is something that he and I talk about a lot, that, you know, it's an easy Hollywood trope to have somebody come back who's a PTSD addled soldier. You know, whether it's the deer hunter in Vietnam, whether it was a Jack Reacher movie with Tom Cruise 2 years ago where it was a veteran who was a sniper killing people in the street. It's easy, and it's kind of a lazy way of writing a character. And it's going to be hard. I agree with you. I mean, there's this weird dichotomy. On the one hand, as a culture, we venerate publicly soldiers. We venerate publicly veterans, and we thank them for their service. We applaud them whenever we can. But at the same time, then there is that question of, is that guy going to go crazy one day? Is that guy going to bring his gun to work and shoot up his office or shoot his wife or shoot his kids? And it's hard. You know, there are organizations out there that are trying. I give President Obama, I give Michelle Obama and Jill Biden a lot of credit because they talk about it very poignantly. They talk all the time about how these wounds don't make a person weak. I did a profile recently of a Medal of Honor winner named Ty Carter. And Ty Carter was one of the bravest heroes of the war in Afghanistan. When his base was being overran, he kept running out to bring ammunition to people. He kept trying to drag back wounded soldiers. I mean, this was a hero by any definition of the word. He's back now. He has PTS. He does not use the word PTSD. He has PTS. He has nightmares. He had alcohol problems. And whenever he travels, and because he's Medal of Honor winner, he has a level of celebrity, he uses every single speech he has to say that seeking help doesn't make you weak, that seeking help makes you strong. And one thing he told me that I found personally very powerful, he said that if you go through war, if you go through the intensity of war, the trauma of war, and you come back and you have not changed, if you're exactly the same as when you left, that's when something is wrong with you. That going to war should change you. You shouldn't be able to go through this and commit the kind of things you commit, see the things you see, live what you live, hear what you hear, and be the same. And that his point, and I find it very, very powerful, is that only then is something wrong with you, if you're the same. And all you can do is hope, I think, that the more people like Ty Carter are out there, the more people hopefully reading this book, the more people who are talking to veterans who are friends of theirs and realizing this guy is not a psychopath, the more it changes. But it's hard. I agree with you, it's hard.
Ma'am, right here. Right here. In the black chair, yeah.
Hi, my name is Deanna Rodriguez. I'm a freelance writer. I'm very interested in this topic because I have many, many friends in the DoD community. I'm hoping that this dialogue will perhaps grow the programs while young men and women are in training to prepare them, and then also when they reintegrate into society, when they come back from the deployments, that it won't be that, oh, I have to go and ask for help, that it will be given automatically, and that there'll be some sort of a reintegration program where they are given tools to self-assist, and that it becomes a normal thing, that of course you're going to have these feelings and these situations arise. Because I think that once they make it an implied, like you were saying, that it's natural to have these anxieties, and after months, if not years, of hypervigilance and this sort of an atmosphere that's completely foreign and different than anything any of us can even imagine, that it will become a normal part of their training and their reintegration into society.
Is that contemplated, Yochi? I mean, that's sort of at the boot camp level. The theory is unit cohesion, break everyone down so they come up together, they stick together. And I'm sure the embedded anxiety is, well, if we acknowledge this at the front end, we're suddenly maybe tampering with unit cohesion. Is that sort of thing at the boot camp level?
It is, and
under
the sort of clinical phrase that's being used, because it is resiliency training. And the idea is that you do try to do exactly what you're suggesting, of giving people tools for while they're there, while they come back, so that it isn't something that they're suddenly struggling with and having no idea to respond to. It's something where they have at least an idea that it may come, and when it comes, have some sense of what to do on their own. And I don't mean, this is funny to me, not because I'm making light of it, but because of how I grew up. My mom, who's sitting here, was somebody who was deeply into yoga before yoga became cool, before it became the thing that everyone is doing. And the military has adopted yoga. It's something that many soldiers, many units do before they deploy to learn how to relax. They do deep breathing. Some units do acupuncture. And it's a lot of things that were sort of out there 30 years ago, when old as I am when I was a kid, but that are now widely accepted. And it's interesting if you're at an Army base, and I've had this experience for the book, where you see 20 really muscular guys walk into a room and unfurl their yoga mats, and suddenly they're doing downward dogs. And that's now becoming part of how they prepare to go to war.
Yes, sir, right there.
Hi, my name is Michael Little. I'm with the Association of the United States Navy. I hear everybody talking about the adverse reaction of someone serving in combat. They come back, PTS kicks in, they ultimately commit suicide. But what about the non-traditional deployers that are deploying to detainee operations? They're seeing the enemy every day when they go to work. They're feeling the mental fatigue every day on a breakdown scale. Maybe the guard force breaks down while they're in the deployment area, and then they come back to nothing. They come back, the lady over here asked about who's accountable at that point. Well, if you deploy individual augmentee, who is accountable? Because your commander that you might come back to may not understand what you just deployed to. So when you start showing signs of PTS, they may not understand what it is that you're going through. We're seeing that more and more in the Navy Reserves, and I apologize for my phone ringing. Sorry about that. And so with that, I just want to make sure that it's aware that this isn't just combat deployers that are going out there. These are also the non-traditional deployers. They're not just in detainee operations. They're in mortuary sciences. They're with civil affairs, and they're seeing this stuff every day on a breakdown scale, and they come back to nothing.
They're also not active duty soldiers. And last year, one of the things that was a tragic kind of buried statistic in the suicide numbers was that the active duty suicides dipped, but the suicides among National Guard, Army Reserve rose. I have a lot of friends who are in the Guard, a lot of friends who are in the Reserve. I think part of it is if you're in the active duty Army, the system is not perfect. No one would say the system is perfect. But if you come back to Fort Bragg, you come back to a community that knows what it is to serve. Your families have other families who know what it's like to have their husband away, their wife away. So the system isn't perfect, but it's there. You come back in the National Guard, let's say, and you go back to the small town where you live. There may not be a VFW facility. There may not be a VA facility. Your neighbors may have never met someone who served, let alone have a support system. So an active duty soldier may come back to an imperfect system. A reservist or guardsman comes back to no system. And that's, I think, a heartbreaking part of this and the reason why these numbers may not go down as much as we would all hope that they would anytime soon.
And I would just say, as a moderator who showed up 30 minutes late, anyone can have their phone go off. You're all forgiven. Okay. Yes, ma'am, right back there.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jackie Garrett. I'm the director of the Defense Suicide Prevention Office. And I know Mark Graham is working really hard tonight because he's been texting me. He's the director for our Vets for Warriors program, which is a program we stood up under the Defense Suicide Prevention Office. So I'm going to take a moment and maybe speak a little bit for Mark, although that's hard because he's usually right out in front of me. But he's not here, so when I have the microphone. One of the things that Mark and I have spent a lot of time, energy, and effort on is building a peer support network within the military community for our active duty Guard and Reserve service members. I'm hearing a lot of misperceptions tonight about who is at risk, and there's a lot of things being thrown around. We know that our biggest risks are among the young junior enlisted who have never deployed, have not been in combat. Only 12 to 14% of those who have died by suicide have actually ever been in combat. We know that this is a problem among our youngest of our troops, predominantly. So what Mark has worked with me, and we've built Vets for Warriors, and this is for you, Mark. VetsForWarriors.com would be the way to get in touch with our 24/7 peer support call center. You can call it, you can chat, you can email. We're about to launch Facebook and a mobile app that will make it more accessible. And I think it's the what we are doing that gets lost in the what's not being done. So and I'm hoping this could be sort of a takeaway message, because I know Mark is passionate about reaching out, asking the right questions, showing that you care, being non-judgmental, educating the community, educating about what you can do. Not what's wrong with the system and bad DOD, bad VA, but what we can do as a community within the military, within the services, at the Guard, Reserve, local. Everybody in this room should leave here tonight knowing that there are resources available, help is out there, treatment works, and Mark is phenomenal at running Vets for Warriors. Thank you.
Right, and Jackie, it's good to see you. My point was not to say that DOD is bad, VA is bad. The people working these issues care profoundly about them. This is not something that, for those who work on this is just another assignment. People take this very seriously. But it is worth pointing out that no system is perfect, and this one is not perfect. No matter how many resources or how hard people work or how well-intentioned those people are. Agreed, the point is not to say that DOD is bad or doesn't care, it does. That the VA is bad and doesn't care, it does. It's to say that there are things that are still flawed. One issue that has come up in research in the book is an issue, and again, a lot of these phrases are clunky, so you'll forgive it, but is means restriction. And what that means is you try to, in a literal way, make it harder for a person to literally kill themselves. So Israel, a few years back, had a very high suicide rate. And what they were discovering was that for decades, Israeli soldiers would go home on leave and bring their guns with them. So if you were in Israel and you'd be at a bus stop, you'd see young Israelis, and they'd be in uniform. They were often kind of shockingly young. They would look like they were 15. And in their little backpack, they'd have their backpack on one side, and they'd have their M16 on the other. And they were discovering that these soldiers were killing themselves in large numbers, A, with those M16s, B. And what they did was take those guns away. The policy changed to, you do not bring your gun home with you on leave. and the numbers fell. And so there's a lot of talk in the civilian world, a lot of talk in the military world about how do you do that in this sphere of soldiers. Soldiers obviously have weapons. They have their military weapon. Many of them have personal weapons. What do you do? How, if any, is there a way to control who has them, to track who has them? And if so, can that help? The short answer is it can. Doing it is much harder. At one point, the NRA had a provision written into a piece of legislation that said an officer or senior enlisted couldn't ask a soldier about his personal handguns. I mean, the NRA kind of snuck this in. And Pete Corelli, who is an interesting man, a very complicated man, a man who's a friend of a lot of us in the room, did all he could with the help of others in the Pentagon, and they got that stripped away. But that was in there. I mean, for a short amount of time, that, without anybody noticing, was this little piece of language that took this idea of making it harder for a person to kill themselves, easier to track a person who might need help, and it made that impossible. And it took time to fix it. You know, we were talking a bit earlier about Bob Gates, about you raised Mike Mullen. One thing that they did that they got zero credit for, because it is in no way sexy at all, I caution that at the outset. On the government-wide security clearance form, you had to indicate if you'd sought help, if you'd had counseling, if you'd been on any kind of medication. And this was the biggest type of stigma and the biggest incentive there possibly could be, because if you said yes, you might not get your clearance. If you said yes, you might lose your clearance. So
and this was a government-wide form.
This was government-wide. This was CIA, it turned out, was the biggest defender of keeping it as it is. And so they looked at this and they thought, this is nuts. If this is in place, if you have to always admit that you've seen help, and if you admit it, you could lose your clearance, you're never going to change this. And the two of them spent nearly 2 years in constant lobbying of the CIA, who pushed back against it very hard. Gates, a former CIA guy, was basically arguing against his old colleagues. They finally got changed. But this was a multi-year fight, chugging along beneath the surface, totally and completely not sexy. They won that fight, but it took a lot. And you think about changing a question on a form, and that took several years. The kind of change that we're talking about that people are, with the best intentions, trying to make, it's not quick, and it's not easy.
Excellent. Next one.
Okay, right there, sir. Will.
Dr. David Fiola here, and maybe some things I can add that will afford some clarity on this. When you talk about PTS minus D, you're not suggesting there's a disorder. So when you incorporate PTSD, something is out of order. So the stigma that's attached to this is also a label. And this label travels with them, like you just exemplified. So if you can compare that type of scenario with PTSD, with don't ask, don't tell, you'll understand that you are hiding pathology. Behavioral health is something that is a taboo, especially with suicide. There's a lot of embarrassment associated with it. So if you can look at it in that regard and realize PTSD is real, and that is the term.
You know, one point that came up in researching the book and playing off your last point about PTSD being real, there is a debate within the military, and it's a legitimate, honest one. And it's sort of a nice way in some ways for us to wrap up the conversation. I'm happy to continue it in the back of the room a bit. But the question of how do you bury, how do you commemorate, how do you memorialize a soldier who killed themselves? And on the one side are the people who say these are casualties of war, and they should be memorialized the same way. Pete Corelli, when he was in Iraq in 2004, when I first met him, lost 168 soldiers to combat. But there was another soldier who killed himself. And when they came back on the memorial wall for the unit, for the division, they had the names of the ones who died in combat, not the name of the one who killed himself. And to this day, he says it's the biggest regret of his life that he did that. But this is not to imply that there are villains. The people who say that there's a difference between being shot on a foot patrol and shooting yourself, the people who say that one deserves to be honored one way, one deserves to be commemorated the other way, they're not bad people. I mean, this is not something where on the whole there are good people and there are bad people and there are heroes and there are villains. This is not black and white. This lives in the gray. And we can accept, and we should and do, I think, that PTSD is real, that these invisible wounds are real. We can accept that. We can, as a society, try to think of how do we fix it. And there are people trying to do just that. But we have to just remember that this is nuanced. This is, in some ways, the epitome of a nuanced issue, that you can't simply, in a way you could look at somebody who needs a prosthetic and say, he needs a prosthetic, give him a prosthetic, he has a prosthetic, his life goes on, he's much better. We don't have that luxury here. And for a country that cares, for Mark and Carol Graham and a family who cares, we need to bear that in mind. This does not go away for the person who has it. This does not go away for the military that has it in its ranks. This does not go away for a country that's struggling with suicide. This does not go away for a family that lost 2 sons and tries to get out of bed in the morning. People do it. People find a way of trying to help. And keep those 2 things in mind. 1, this issue will be there a long time. 2, there are people out there trying to make it better. With that, I thank you all for your time.